Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to be here with my friend, colleague, just someone is one of my absolute favorite historians, Professor Suzannah Lipscomb. Welcome, Suzannah, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled you're here.
It's always a pleasure to see you, Caroline, and it's lovely to have a chance to talk history with you.
Yes, so that's what we're doing. We're talking history, different kinds of history, different ways of looking about history. And one of the things I'm so excited and I've been waiting to talk to Suzannah about is a book she worked on. And it's really interesting because here we have sort of the first version E.H. Carr's What is History? And then Suzannah and Dr. Helen Carr looked at it 60 years later in sort of a new way. And Helen is H. Carr's great granddaughter. So it's just a really exciting through line of a family looking at history. And then I have a paperback that I can write in and take notes in. So I have that I'll have right with me now. But history seems to be right now sort of a hot topic and popular, and in some cases, violently controversial. I mean, literally in some scary ways. And one of the things I wanted to ask about, there's a quotation, and in here we have many quotations, and one is Roy Strong, who for years has been very well respected, and he says, "The past is the past, so you can't rewrite it. It is what it is. Don't look at it again." Sort of, if you look at it in a different way, you're rewriting history, and that's been a big debate. I know here in the US, and I believe in the UK as well, and all over the world, that there's no recognition that it was already being rewritten, that these past records that we think are so sacrosanct are written by people with their own agenda. So how do you sort of think about that? And the past isn't just the past, it's still happening, and we can still look at it and learn from it.
So, some of the problem is linguistic. We use the word history or the word the past to mean two different things in English.
Mm-hmm.
It's both what actually happened, as it were, in the past, what took place, and it is the study of it, the subject, the discipline of history. And I think Roy Strong, in that line of saying the past is the past, you can't rewrite history, is aligning those two versions of it.
Mm.
So he's saying you can't rewrite the books because to do so changes what happened in the past. But of course, it doesn't change what happened in the past. What happened in the past happened. The versions of history that we write today, are all interpretations. This
Mm-hmm.
is what Carr's great idea was in that first book, What is History?
Right.
That all history is interpretation, means interpretation. And so every time you write a history book, you're hopefully the writer is trying to get closer to the truth of what happened. And every time new information emerges, then you have an opportunity to move another step closer. And the subject of history is all about building on the work of others. It's all standing on the shoulders of giants. And
Mm-hmm.
so I always find it very strange when people don't credit other people's work, because we're like, this is what the thing is. It's a collaborative effort, right?
Right.
We all work together. We're all trying to get towards this aim of getting a closer version of what actually happened. And so all history is being rewritten all the time.
Right.
So a version of it that was written in the 1950s, a version of the written in the 1950s about Elizabeth I's reign, will be rewriting a version written in the 1890s about Elizabeth I's reign, and so on
Yes.
back to Elizabeth
Mm-hmm.
I's reign. And each age writes from their own perspective and brings their
Right.
own viewpoint. We all write subjectively, however much we try to write objectively, like,
Yes.
but also we're all drawing on what it is that we know. And the thing is that we are finding out more new stuff all the time. So
Yes.
it's completely disingenuous to say you can't rewrite history, because it suggests it suggests a complete falsehood. There has never been any version of history that is written that wasn't an interpretation.
Right.
And so it's just really important, I think, to aim for the most truthful version possible and the most objective version possible. And that means that when new information comes along, you've got to write the textbook again.
Right. And that even when it's sometimes messy or painful to talk about or demonstrates a part of a culture that made bad decisions, you still need to include that. There's a movement in the US that in some places and some elected officials are saying out loud, we shouldn't look at that, we shouldn't study that. That can make students uncomfortable, which I think is not a bad thing. Students should be uncomfortable about certain things, but there's just this sort of disappointing desire to soften and not look at it carefully and not look at it realistically when it is troubling. And you say something that I think is really interesting, because the idea is we weaken the past if we look at the dark parts. And what you say is instead the reverse is true. It is when we persist in viewing the tainted past uncritically that we continue to sully the present. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know in the US, there is just this whitewashing, literally in some cases, going on to make it all jolly and fun at times that were not.
Yes, and I think with to that idea of being uncomfortable, if you are not uncomfortable that millions of people were enslaved by others,
Right.
then there is something fundamentally wrong with you, right? You should
Right.
be uncomfortable
You
about
should
that.
be. Yes.
It is necessary to be uncomfortable. There is such a thing as righteous anger. You should be angry and uncomfortable that these things have happened. So the comment I made there was in response to the fact that we had a very similar discussion going on over here.
Yeah.
In 2020, the National Trust, which looks after historic properties across the UK, released a report that talked about the connections between their properties and the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism.
Okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
a magazine called The Spectator had an article by a chap called Charles Moore in which he said that it was a shameful manifesto. And I was really struck by these words, because he didn't mean we have uncovered the shame of our history.
Right.
He
Right.
meant that this might make the British feel ashamed, and therefore we shouldn't look at
And
it.
therefore we shouldn't look. Yes.
And yet, it seemed to me that the deeply shameful thing to do here is not to look,
Right.
because it's suggesting that let's just go on with the fairy tale that everything in the past was happy, and people who were enslaved were jolly about it and actually
Yes.
liked it, and it
Yes.
was a benevolent condition that they were in, and they were just being looked after, and all this sort of nonsense that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. And
Right.
yet it sullies us in the present in multiple ways. It sullies us as historians, because it suggests that we don't actually care about trying to get to the truth.
Right.
It sullies us as people who are descendants
Yes.
of not just the people who were in power, but also the people who were oppressed.
Yes.
And it means that we're giving a version of history that says that we are going to continue to uphold the dominance of the powerful in the past, and that we don't care about telling the stories of the people who were not powerful, who were powerless in the past. And it is precisely the kind of erasure of history that people complain about from the other end of the spectrum. They say, "Oh, we're erasing our past because we're whitewashing our past. We're, you're rewriting history." And yet, in the very action of refusing to look at evidence about the past, they are trying to make sure that history doesn't get seen with a bright light. It just remains murky.
Dim. Yeah. Right. And you do see that, and people, it's sort of astonishing that people today would still be saying these kinds of things, that we really seem not to have embraced that idea that the more we know, yes, bad decisions were made, terrible decisions were made, terrible things were done. Let's figure it out. Let's really look at it. And there's a reluctance.
I think a lot of it comes from the way we identify with the past. So there's a big move towards interest in genealogical history, family history. and been gathering pace for the last decades, and people are very interested in finding out what their ancestors did.
Right.
And it's uncomfortable if you find out your ancestor was on the wrong side of history. They were the slave owners, for example. I think we also see this in a kind of more collective sense. So British people will talk about how we won the war, we won the Battle of Agincourt, which happened in 1415, right? So,
right.
So like 20 generations ago, and yet they'll talk about we won the war. So there's kind of identification with the English in 1415 with the British today.
And the victory.
That's obviously the victory. Yeah, we don't talk about the ones we didn't win.
Yes.
And so what I think it comes down to is this, what Benedict Anderson called the imagined community. So the nation is an imagined community, and you imagine yourself to be part of this line. And actually, therefore, we have to reorient our views on people in the past, including our ancestors. We have to allow that people have done bad things. Good people have done bad things, as well as bad people. And so the other fundamental thing it challenges is kind of our notion of whether humans are good or bad. This is like the fundamental theological question,
Yes.
And about original sin and all that sort of thing. It's all black and white. It's much better to be able to think that you're good and Hitler is evil and there is nowhere between. Whereas actually, I find this so maddening. Like in practice, I know that I'm awful at times, just as much as I'm probably lovely at times, and the same is true of everybody else I know.
Yes. And
I mean, sometimes this is on a grand scale. I'm not suggesting that the Middle Passage was someone just being mean for a day. I'm like, obviously some things it's on a different level, but the fact is that we can often hide from the truth of what is going on and what is happening in the world and how it affects us. And I'm sure that's true today in all sorts of ways with regard to fashion or our food consumption, in ways that in a century's time, they're going to look back and say, those people were complicit.
Right. Yes. The idea that we're somehow apart from that or separate from that because we're so good, and we don't want to become uncomfortable by facing some of the issues where maybe we weren't so good. And but is it we?
Yes, like it's right. It may be what us, but it might be our great grandparents.
Right. Yes. And that all good or all bad with no complexity is that whole thing is a bit concerning just in and of itself. So a lot of things going on, and just this reluctance to look closely at some of the murky decisions of maybe family members of our own or others in history and make it all seem sort of jolly is, as you say, concerning, and shows that's how it's perpetuated. That's how we only choose certain voices to listen to because we don't want to trouble. Those are really the people who don't want to be troubled, the ones who are still benefiting from ways of looking at things.
Yes, that's really true. And it's very much that. It's very much that it's favorable to those who are powerful now to continue to have a narrative that justifies their power.
Right. Yes.
But it's really interesting. I find that the average man on the street is still quite invested in this country and seeing Britain as a great country, even though it really has stopped being a great country, if it ever was, a very long time ago, and its greatness rested on a lot of pain done to people outside this country. And it's like, so there's versions of history told that really end with the cliffs of Dover, as opposed to thinking about the British anywhere else in the world.
Yes.
But that is interesting because it's about what it means politically today. So this is where the tire really hits the road, and I'm absolutely certain this is the case in the United States as well.
Yes,
because it's what it means for politics today, what it means for your identity as an American, as a Brit. What does it mean to be of that nationality? What what's the story? And so
Right.
it's about grappling with identity as much as anything else.
Yes, because if you want that sort of special status, oh, we're American, we're British, and then we have to embrace how we got here. And that means for many people not looking at the murkiness along the sidelines. You just tell that one main story without realizing that's only the story of a very slender slice of what was going on at the time. But that perpetuates your ability to connect with it. And I find that children that, there's, oh, we've got to protect the children. Children are willing to learn things that I think adults are reluctant. I think that's a real fallacy in some of what we're being told. Oh, we must keep the children safe from being uncomfortable. Children learn, I think, more readily in a lot of ways.
Oh, yes, of course they do, because they haven't got all the baggage yet.
Yes. And that's exactly who should be experiencing this broader story, because hopefully if they experience it as they grow, they can start to make different, wider, more complex decisions. So I just think that, the focus in education, not is protect our little babies from being uncomfortable, is, directly the wrong thing in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, you can only make up your mind if you have access to the options.
Right.
And I love the fact that we're bringing up children today who don't, at least here I'd say, who don't even, it doesn't occur to them for a moment that women can't work or that women can't achieve things in the same way as men. Like we're getting the first generation of
right.
Not post-feminist, because you can never be post-feminist, but those who benefited from the feminist movement, and suddenly believe everything is possible for them because they haven't been given a bunch of ideas about it not being possible for them,
right.
as girls, for example. And bringing up a boy, I'm bringing him up obviously to believe that about women as well. So
right.
So it's if you've got to trust young people. If you
yes.
give them the opportunity to think big, then they will do so.
They will. And I think that's the hope, right? Give them that opportunity because they have the capacity and the desire to think bigger. They haven't narrowed themselves yet in the way that adults begin to over time. So let's turn to a particular period of history. So sort of above my head are some of your Tudor books. You have done a lot in that era, as have I, in the early modern era. So when we talk about having dialogue, so one of the things in What is History Now, how the past and present speak to each other. So if we use the Tudors as an example, what kinds of dialogues are we able to have with that era as we learn more? So over time, over the last, you mentioned in the 50s and the 60s, over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, what have we learned about the Tudors that we continue to have dialogues with them or to continue to engage with a period from that long ago?
Well, let me take it even further back, actually, because one thing that interests me is the way in which the Tudors, Henry VIII, Elizabeth chiefly, but became our kind of founding fathers, I suppose. So they have that sort of status because Henry VIII was responsible for establishing the Navy, and because we get the first glimmerings of empire under Elizabeth. Right. So in the early 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was happening, the Hungry 40s, the 1840s, and you've got all this shift to a scary world, there rose a fascination with the pre-industrial world, like the merry old England.
Yes.
And when you get books by Sir Walter Scott and others that talk about this previous time when everything was wonderful,
it was lovely.
And that fascination with the Tudors really digs in deep in the 19th century through into the early 20th century. So when there was a big new housing project in the 1920s and 30s, houses were built to look like Tudor houses. So across the UK, houses from the 1930s have wooden beams stuck to the outside of them, so they look like they were made in the 16th century. It is the most bizarre thing.
Yes.
So weird. And like, so you've got mock Tudor pubs, and you've got mock Tudor housing. So there's this fascination with the Tudors for a good century there. You know,
Mm-hmm.
cigarettes were sold in the 19th century with pictures of Drake and Raleigh on them. Raleigh
Yeah.
because, you know, apparently he brought tobacco back, you know,
Yes, right. Yes.
not quite
And
true, but, you know, he popularized it.
yes.
Um, and so the for a long time, they stood for uh, the beginnings of Britain becoming great.
Okay. Okay.
And also, we've got, of course, the Church of England breaking
Yes.
away from the Roman Catholic Church, this sort of sense of plucky little England.
Yes.
And
Right.
also Protestantism not being like the filthy, tainted
Yeah.
popery of Rome.
Yes. Yes.
So Mary the First became known as Bloody
Bloody
Mary.
Mary then. Yeah.
We are literally just crawling out from under this stone.
Yeah.
So, in terms of how we talk about these figures, um, how we talk about Mary the First, for example,
Mary
it's
is a great
radically
example.
changed in the
Yeah.
last like 10, 15 years, when all sorts of information has come out about the ways in which she wasn't just Bloody Mary. Haven't you found
Right.
that?
Yes. Yes. And that the others, you know, Edward was certainly as bloody as you know, that was the time. That wasn't Mary. And the new scholarship on her is exciting, but I see some resistance to it in some ways. So when something comes out that's positive, you'll see comments like, oh, you mean Bloody Mary? I mean, it's hard for people to let go of that.
Well, we like our verities, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. She's
We
the
like
villain.
things
We
in
have a
black and
villain
white.
in the story, and she ends up being the villain. Yeah. It's extraordinary.
But you're right about the numbers. I mean, even on a statistical level, so there's a rebellion in 1549, Kett's Rebellion, as you
Yeah.
well know, and after that, in the 2 weeks it takes to suppress that rebellion, as many people are killed by Edward's henchmen as are killed at the stake by Mary. That's
Right.
just, you know, that's just like a raw comparison of data. So and actually Elizabeth I has quite a lot of people killed. They're Catholic priests, so you know you don't
You
need to
don't
worry
need to
about them
count
so much. But
that.
the 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 fact is that there is nothing nice about the burnings. I'm talking to you from Oxford. Just
Hmm.
down the road is the site at which Latimer and Ridley and later Cranmer were
Right.
burnt. Like
Right.
this is not nice stuff, but
Right.
that doesn't mean that there isn't anything good that happens in Mary's reign,
Yes.
and
Right.
we can explore the reasoning for these things happening as well. And the truth of the matter is that perhaps one could say, you know, mainstream Protestantism wasn't getting this treatment elsewhere, but everybody in the 16th century believed that there was a right way and there was a wrong way to God.
Yes.
They didn't think
Yes.
that you could have shades. They didn't think there
No.
were options along this.
No.
They thought you
No.
were either getting it right or you were getting it wrong. And if you were wrong, you were a heretic and you were going to inspire God's wrath. And in an age of influenzas and epidemics, you didn't need any
Yes.
more of that.
Right. And she was saving the soul of her nation, she believed. And yes. And I just did a talk last night at Smithsonian on Ferdinand and Isabella. They were doing the other, it wasn't only happening, you know, because they were targeting the Jews and the Muslims because Catholics weren't that populous in Spain, but they were also cleansing their nation for God.
Yes, I've
So,
spent a lot of time working on them recently because I was writing
yes,
about Catherine of Aragon's early life. And you're absolutely
yeah,
right that, I mean, Isabel is completely convinced that this is the right thing to do. And it does mean that we have to kind of overleap this gap between ourselves and the past in this
yes,
completely different way of seeing things. We do not
mm-hmm.
think it is Christian to go around having auto da fe for people who are we think are apostates, but
Yes,
this is
yes,
what they think is absolutely necessary to rid
yes,
the country and create a true unified Spain that is holy.
yes, yes, right, because that's better for Spain. That's better for the future. That's going to save them all. And it's a mindset we don't share, but we can try to understand it and work toward that. So so as we look at the Tudors as an example, or Ferdinand and Isabella Spain as an example, this early modern period, one of the things that stands out, and Isabella, certainly Catherine of Aragon, these women who are extremely well educated. So we do have some records of them who are very strong willed, who are so fascinating. But one of the things that's happening is other women often don't get recorded, don't write themselves. Women's education, these women stand out. Thomas More he stood out because he educated his daughters. Most women at the time, well, most people weren't getting that, but women particularly. So I know, and I want to talk about, you've got a course coming up with HistFest in October, Restoring Women to History. And it's specifically looking at women who have been left out. So one of the groups who have been left out are women. And so can we talk about, one of the phrases I love from the description is, some of the women, if we know them at all, it's generally because of a handful of words about them were written down by a man. So the question is then, can we restore them to history? So can you talk to us about the course? And one of the ways you've done that, wrong way, with Voices of Nimes. So talk about that a little bit, because that's part of the course as well. So sort of take us into that. For those, unlike Catherine of Aragon or Isabella, who are written in, so many are written out.
They are written in, although there's still more we can do with them, but yes, that's another story. So for those majority of women, a majority of people in the past,
right,
but especially women, were not literate. That maybe 5% of women were literate in the 16th century. So we don't have what historians call ego literature. We don't have their diaries and their letters and their innermost thoughts to get at. We don't even know what they're doing with their days. So we have to find evidence that we can use to to access them somehow. And we have to think about where that's possible.
Right.
And it tends to be where ordinary women have had an encounter with the powerful, as Michel Foucault put it, where power has marked them with its claw. And so in this 4-part course, there's 4 lectures and 4 Zoom sessions and Q&As. I'm looking at various ways of handling that. So the first lecture is exploring this problem, the problem of power in the archives, the problem of getting at women, and thinking about methods that we can use to do that, like reading against the grain. So for example, with court records, which is what I was using in Nimes, although it's not straightforwardly a court, but we'll come back to that. You can get at the testimonies of ordinary women. And so they're not written down by those women. They're being written down by a male scribe. They are being written down sometimes in a language other than that in which they're given. The records are kept in French in that instance, and some of the comments would have certainly been in Occitan, which is a local dialect. They're being transformed from a first or second person narrative into a third person narrative. We can't see where the scribes or the interrogators leading questions start and where they end. There's lots of problems. We can't assume that this is authentic female speech at all times, but assuming we try and compensate for those things and take them into account, we can nevertheless, I think, see authentic details about women's lives. And so reading against the grain is reading a document for a purpose other than that which the author had in mind. And then in the rest of the course, so once we kind of looked at several different methods, that's just one method, we look at several different methods for trying to get to these women. And then we look at 3 case studies. And case study number 1 is looking at witchcraft. So looking at women accused of witchcraft, and we're going to draw on the work of Malcolm Gaskell and Lyndall Roper. So that's 17th century England, the 1640s during the Civil War, and Lyndall Roper's 17th century Germany, and look at the trial records that we have, and look at these women who were accused of being witches, and what happens when they confess or they deny. Like, what is it that they're saying, and what can we learn from that? So it's deeply moving stuff, because the problem is when people are happy, when women were happy, when bad things weren't happening to them, they don't appear in the sources. So a lot of these stories are traumatic.
Yes. Yes.
The second case study comes from my work for the Voices of Nimes. So it's drawing on the 90 odd cases of sexual assault or rape that I found in the
Yeah.
records of the consistory, which was the Protestant governing tribunal of the Calvinist Church.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to look in particular at several women's cases and really kind of, so I'm going to send people the raw material, so the transcript
Mm-hmm.
that I have transcribed and translated for them. I'll give them the French as well, but and sometimes the Occitan, but I'll so that they can really see what it looks like, and then we can think about how you take a transcript like that once you've found it in the manuscripts
Right.
and
Yes.
translated it,
Finding it. Yeah.
and make it into, how do you use that as history?
Okay. Yeah.
So we're going to be looking at that, and this extraordinary fact that these women, in a very rare instance, were able to bring cases against those who assaulted them.
Yes.
And then the final case study is looking at it's looking at broadly at the intersection of gender and race, but particularly looking at instances from 18th century Barbados, 19th century Americas, and just trying to get a sense of how we deal then with the silences in the archives, and what evidence does survive. I mean, there's just a vast silence, it turns out, for the millions of women who were enslaved and brought across the Atlantic, and men obviously as well. But we have I think it's maybe 6 autobiographical narratives so far.
Okay.
One was very recently found, for example, but that gives you some sense of scale.
Right.
So
yes.
there's been such amazing work by scholars of color who are pressing at the limits of the archive, and so we're going to be thinking about what we do when the archive appears to limit us. Where do we go from there?
So can we talk a little bit? That is all so amazing, and I can't wait. But can we talk a little bit about the archive? Because as I go to England to do research, and I'll go to the British Library, I'll go to the National Archives, and that seems to be the place to go. So tell us a little bit about how the archives, although wonderful, are in and of themselves limited.
So they are all wonderful, and exactly, we have to, it's an amazing privilege to use the National Archives, the British Library, the archives across the countries, across the world.
Yes.
And we all depend, and I'm a really big advocate of going back to the manuscripts and going back to the archives, and not relying on printed versions of them where possible. But I guess it's recognizing that the information that was collected reflected what the powerful thought was interesting at the time. So there's a good example from Saidiya Hartman's work. She wrote this wonderful book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. It's a really provocative book. It's very much on the edges of the historical discipline. And one of the things it does is it looks at the lives of young Black women in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and in cities in the US, at a time when there was a law, I think it lasts from 1885 to 1925, which said that women who were thought to be in danger of moral depravity could be arrested. And so this meant that women who were found out on the streets at night, who were having sexual relationships outside of marriage, who were out dancing, who were coming back late from work, these women, these young women, could be and were arrested and incarcerated in reformatories. And what Professor Hartman argues is that the archives of the slum officers, the prison parole officers, the the state documents at these reformatories, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What they are fictions. Because
Okay.
they're telling lies about these girls and women. And so there's an instance in which the official archive as it
Right.
exists is limited
Mm-hmm.
in the truth that it tells.
Right. And if that's all you read and you take it at face value, it can mislead your understanding. And
Exactly.
I just think that's really interesting to think about. The archives were curated all along. People had agendas all along about what got written down, who was writing it, how it was recorded, how that story was told. So that's always been something that's been driven by an agenda. And
Exactly.
yeah, and I think, if you can imagine 100 years from now, somebody researching what happened with COVID, they would certainly see a number of agendas, and their interpretation would completely depend on whose view they read, because the
Precisely.
whole scale was available. So
Yes, yes, yes.
so
Yeah.
we talk about women's voices and the silences and how we can find the silences. And you've talked about some of the ways we can look in different places and places that might not be thought of, where they are marked. And that's a really powerful idea. They were marked by the powerful. That's so compelling. As we think about that, why is, and I know, but why is it so important to find these women's voices, to look into the silence and find these voices? How does that help us?
Well, in part, it's about saying that they matter, which is about saying that women matter today as much as anything else. I mean,
Right.
so I'm not saying history is not. I already said we all write subjectively. So
Mm-hmm.
we all write from our present point of view. I happen to think that women are important. So
Right.
I
Yeah. Yes.
call me radical. And so therefore, I think that telling the stories of women in the past matters. And the same is true of telling the stories of indigenous people or people of
Yes.
color. Like, so that
Mm-hmm.
there's a sense for me in which the version of the world that you want to see is the version of the past that you need to tell. It's also therefore about challenging dominant narratives of power.
Right.
um, and ultimately I think it's because my sense is that I mean, I feel like we have a duty to these people.
Yeah.
I don't mean to sound too soppy about it, but my sense when I am dealing with women of the past is that I owe it to them to try and get at their lives. I owe it to the thousands of obscured lives to try and
Right.
say something about the ones that I can reach.
Yes.
And we need to tell these stories about the past to determine the nature of the present.
Mm-hmm.
They did exist. We may not know about them, but they did exist. And I suppose in the end, it's something like an act of love. I've called it in my piece to
Yeah.
try and retrieve them.
Right. No, I think that's really true. And that is something that has value for all of us, to see and hear them more fully. And it allows us to see and hear the past history more fully when we can see their place in it, as difficult as it is sometimes to do so. So shining that light on all of it is really important. So as we finish up, what are you working on now? Where can we find you? And tell us a little more. And of course, I'll have all of this available as well. But tell us where we can find more about this course coming up, because that's so
So
exciting.
thank you. Yeah, the course is called Restoring Women to History. It starts on October 2nd, but and it will be running at 7 p.m. UK time for the lecture, and then there'll be a live, I think it's an hour later, there's a live Q&A. But say that's 1 p.m. your time, whatever, say that's not a good time for you, it is available to you after that point. You just, you can get around the world.
Right. Yes.
So the easiest way to find out more about it is to go to my website, which is www.susannahlipscomb.com, and click on the tab that says courses.
Okay.
And then you can click through from there to the place to book it. And I ought to say also, it is, I don't know what this is in dollars, it's £40. So what's that, $65?
Yeah, ish. It changes
something?
daily. So
it changes.
Yes,
but
yes.
It's I think it's very good value.
It's very good value. Yes, for a lengthy course. Yes, absolutely.
So, and I'm going to run some courses in the future that are going to be far more expensive, but they're going to be far more.
So do it now.
So do it now. Make the most of this one. But what I wanted was that this would be accessible to nearly everybody, and that there's going to be text, the things to read. You don't have to, it's completely optional, but if you want to do that deep dive, I'm going to send things over for people to read in advance, and we're going to have live Zooms, and so it's really going to be great. A really great opportunity to get stuck into some of these questions, and as I've already said, I think it matters.
Yes, and that's great. And I will have links to that. And HistFest is great for, they do all kinds of really fun programs. So I'm so excited that you're going to do this. Yes, and
I want to say that Rebecca Radil, who runs HistFest, is an amazing sort of advocate for telling these new versions of history. She's really good at making sure that all of the voices of the past are heard.
Yes.
And featuring that kind of diversity. And she's the one who approached me and said, would you like to do a course? So first of all, we have to mention Rebecca for making it happen.
And she is wonderful. So yes. And she often, I don't know if she'll be introducing you, but often when she does these, she introduces, so you get a little bit of her personality as well, which is always great. So that's great. And so you've mentioned your website. You're on social media as well, if people want to follow.
Yeah, I'm on social media generally at 16th, written out as a word, C, capital C for century, and girl, 16th century girl. I'm working on a new history of Henry VIII's queens that won't be out for a couple of years, but that's what I'm working on right now. And looks like there's some new TV coming as well, but more in the future about
more
that.
To come. All right, well, we'll keep updating people on that. Well, thank you so much for joining. I know it's evening for you, so thank you very much at the end of your day for coming on, talking about history, raising these really important questions about what history is, what it is now, and how the past and present speak to each other. I just think that's so wonderful. And we will look forward to the course. Encourage everybody to sign up. I will be there. I can't wait. And thank you, Suzannah, for being here with me.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's really lovely to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you too. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will keep working together. I'll give you all the information on Suzannah and the course as we keep shaking up history together. Thank you.